The last question about government that I'll touch on briefly is, what do we tax? And to the full extent possible, economic theory suggests that we should tax bads to the full extent possible instead of taxing goods. And from across the political spectrum, conservative economists, liberal economists, middle-of-the-road economists are united in arguing that we should increase taxes on pollution, and taxes on pollution move markets toward efficiency. Taxes on labor effort, investment effort, create inefficiency. The difference between liberal and conservative economists, though, I should mention, is that liberal economists would argue that the revenues from taxing pollution should be used to increase government services. Most typically, proponents of such taxes argue that the revenue should be used to build public transit or to improve public transit systems, subways, buses, trains, etc. The conservatives tend to argue that increased revenues from pollution taxes should be used to reduce taxes, in particular payroll taxes that fall disproportionately on relatively poor people that are going to have to, frankly, pay a bigger share of the pollution taxes because the bigger shares of their income are spent on energy, which would get taxed pretty heavily under a pollution tax. Anyway, that tends to be the difference, but we all agree that taxing pollution and not work effort or investment effort is desirable. Let me just give you a brief illustration of why that is. When we have a good thing, this is a labor market, and income taxes are a huge revenue generator for government. Anyway, what we do when we think of a tax, we're creating a wedge. The employer pays more than the laborer receives. That vertical distance between the demand curve, the price that employers pay, and the supply curve, the take-home pay of workers, is the tax. This is the tax. I should be doing this in a different color. Let me change colors here. The employers pay W1, this higher wage bill, and workers receive W1 minus whatever tax there is, and then there's a reduction in employment. Now, a couple things come about because labor supply curves are so vertical for almost everybody except for women with children, apparently. Anyway, one thing is the deadweight loss is there, but it's small because that vertical function. You can think through the case if it were a flatter function, we'd have bigger deadweight loss because of that tax. But there is deadweight loss created. The other thing about a tax on labor effort is that the incidence of the tax, who pays the most of the tax, it falls disproportionately on workers. This is the workers' share is the amount by which the wage falls. And then the employer's share is the amount by which wage bills go up. And because employers can employ capital, or they can employ more skilled labor, less unskilled labor, or they're flexible in how they produce goods and services for the most part. Their demand curve for labor tends to be downward sloping. But workers are pretty much in the labor force, and we generally estimate supply curves, certainly for the overall labor market, as essentially vertical, and this means the incidence of the taxes on workers. And that doesn't matter. The payroll tax is split evenly between employers and workers, but that's just a sham. The economic incidence, the impact on the take-home pay going down is almost entirely on the workers because of the nature of the labor supply. So the economic incidence of the tax is absolutely independent of the legal incidence of the tax. The legal incidence is the fact that they collect half from the workers and half from the bosses. But economically, that all ends up coming from the pockets of workers. Anyway, taxing a good is bad. It reduces the amount of the good that whether it's goods being produced or labor being hired, it reduces that activity and creates deadweight loss. It also takes well, if the money is being used to provide goods and services or transfers that are valued by the citizenry, well then, taking the money out of the workers' pockets and using it to provide something they value potentially more, that's not a huge harm. But nevertheless, the deadweight loss is a considerable problem, however that money is spent. By contrast, consider the case of pollution. Remember that in the case of a bad, the market outcome occurs where the supply curve, the marginal private cost function, intersects the demand curve, and we assume there's no demand side externalities. So that's both the marginal private value and the marginal social value function. Well, remember that because past the sufficient level of outcome, every unit of output costs society more than it benefited anyone in society. Waste was created by every unit of output past Q star, and we end up with the market outcome creating this waste, this deadweight loss, equal in area to this shaded triangle. I need a color that's more different. So let's think instead about the case where we have a pollution tax. If we have a pollution tax that is equal in size to the negative externality at the socially optimum quantity, that's this vertical distance here, then we can bring the private costs, marginal private costs plus this optimal tax, to the point where private incentives are in line with the socially best outcome. So what happens? We get, yes, buyers of the product pay more, but they should, because valuable resources are being used that previously weren't being charged for, and P1 minus T is the amount sellers receive. And lo and behold, we get this revenue. So we get government revenue because of this tax, as each unit is taxed at level T, that's that vertical distance. We sum it over all units sold. The revenue is this area, this green area here. But notice that in collecting this government revenue and taxing this good, we actually eliminate this deadweight loss. We bring this outcome in this market, this is gasoline market, we bring the market to an outcome that's more efficient. So we both collect government revenue and increase efficiency, and this is a great gain all the way around, and it's why economists from across the spectrum argue that we should be shifting taxes away from good things to bad things. A gas tax, just for an example, I think the average gas tax in the United States is 20, 30 cents a gallon, but the negative externalities associated with using a gallon of gas are on the order of somewhere between $6 and $10 per gallon. So that's a huge revenue source. That would also, of course, speed the adoption of cleaner forms of producing energy, which probably translates to either electric or hydrogen vehicles. One argument against shifting taxes that way is that, oh my goodness, the pollution will create an incentive to clean up all this pollution and we'll lose our tax base. And, that's true over time, but, what a problem to have no pollution because we had created this incentive to get rid of the pollution. And in that situation where we don't have any more bad things to tax, well, okay, then we have to turn to taxing good things. But let's wait until that point before we start taxing these highly desirable activities, people risking their wealth to fund desirable projects in the economy. We tax interest earnings, capital gains, but also labor effort. One of the central goals of government is to create an environment in which people can be hired gainfully, as much as possible. And in taxing that work effort, we create a disincentive. Well, that's perverse, and we should do less of that if that's possible. And that is possible if we can shift taxes toward bad things.